working yet. Okay, now it works.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get started for today's meeting. I saw Josh joined. Yeah, hi Josh.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay, let's and let me share my screen. Yes, go ahead. Can you see my screen now?
Sure can.
Okay. Josh, Miran, or Fan, do you have any topic you want to add? So currently we only have two agenda items today. One is to check the notation V1 status. Another is to ask for the vote for the new GitHub repository.
Yeah, just the GitHub repository is all I have. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, then we start from the top. The first thing is that we need to check the notation V1 status. Our original plan is to cut the release on June 12th. And recently, we did some internal testing that we found some issues. One of the issue is the first one about a bug in notation login logout, and we discussed this issue last week. And I think this issue should be fixed in V1. Any comments on that, on this first item? Currently, this issue, we didn't mark the milestone yet. So if everyone agrees that, I will change the milestone to V1 scope. Samuel, please.
Yeah, I think I have no issues with fixing this issue for the next release. I still have some open questions based on what you wrote in the issue. So time permitting, after we've done everything, I'd like to come back to this and clarify my understanding of this issue. But I think I'm okay with this being fixed in V1.0.0.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, then I will change the milestone. The next one are three new issues we found recently during some negative testing for notation. So I'm not sure whether Samuel or Pradesh, you have read these issues.
Yeah, we did. We did, and we left some comments on how to improve the language a little bit. I think Pritesh pointed me to them. I reviewed them. He left some comments. I left some comments on top of that. For example, Pritesh left a comment just to give a workaround, or not a workaround, but the solution. Like he added use command notation cert add to create. And then what I added was the type CA. We could have two types of X509 certificates, CA or signing authority. So if you look at my comment, the one below it, I used Pritish's language and I added signing authority in the middle as well, because the trust store could either be of type CA or of type signing authority.
Yeah, it makes sense. Do you agree that this will be V1 scope?
It is not a showstopper for V1. None of these are to me, but if they're available, we can pick it up. Given a choice, I would like to keep V1 simple and only bring in critical issues, because that's what we agreed. That's what we agreed to just bring critical issues. As long as it doesn't break any test cases, because in the past test cases have been broken because of us fixing something. So I'm not very keen for bringing them in V1.0.0. But if everybody else thinks these are low risk, then I can be convinced.
Yeah, maybe I can give some context on this. So a couple of weeks ago, basically, I had spoken with Dee and Shuey to kind of like go battle test this in all the negative cases. Toddy had given quite a lot of feedback because of all the errors that you hit and people are not able to even make any progress. For example, if you look at this specific issue, if you go down to line number 6, you find out the policy configuration name is instead. We know upfront that this can be mitigated because it just stops any kind of adoption to any of these things, right? So, like you said, if there are low risk and if it's just string correction, then I think it can meet the bar. But if it's actually changing like some major flow, then definitely not. Somebody, does it give you kind of context as to why these
Yes.
issues were open like last minute? I mean, it's basically my
Yeah.
push to get everybody to just validate these failure cases.
No, I think these do appear to be low risk. That's why Pratish and I jumped on it when we saw it this morning. I think my vote will be if if Pratish and Shive can confirm and that, hey, these are extremely low risk and nothing's else gonna break, then we can bring them in v1.0.0. I'm just not closer to the code to tell you if these are extremely low risk or not. But if low risk, let's bring them in. Pratish, your thoughts? If you're talking on mute.
Yeah, I agree that I mean they should be really low risk one subjecting the other message. So yeah, if they are like 1 or 2 liner changes, then yeah, we should bring them in.
And Pritish, while you're on the you have the mic, even for the 696 issue or the first issue we were discussing today, you agree for bringing it in v1.0.0?
Yeah, the first one, yeah, we should bring it for sure. That's a major behavior change. So
The
we should
login
do
logout one.
that. Yes. I mean, that's a missing functionality or a bug, I would call that. Here it's just more about improving the UX.
Hey guys, am I audible? Hello.
Yeah, I'm Aaron.
So, I mean, I noticed that issue. The very first issue was mentioned about running it on WSL, right? If I'm not mistaken. I did this a couple of days ago, and I did check it just now. Mine works properly, and I was able to log into GitHub in my instance without any issue, as long as I had perfectly run Docker credential pass beforehand. I was able to use this properly. So could we double check if like the user had done that? Because I was able to log in correctly as intended in my instance.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. You are talking about this one, right?
Yeah, 696. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a brief explanation here. So actually, before we release RC7 and 6 notation supports using the credential store from the Docker config. But the recent this issue, this bug broke the experience for notation login, logout only. So that means if you didn't configure the credential store in notation config, notation will not check the credential store from Docker config.
Yeah.
This one.
Okay.
Yeah, and the new scenario that enabled in RC6 and RC7 is there are some cases that the user didn't configure any credential store in the system.
Yeah.
So in that case, by default, if you use Docker login, Docker will save the plain test credentials encoded by base 64 into the Docker config file. Before release RC6.7, notation doesn't support read these credentials, but now we support reading these credentials if user use Docker login when there is no credential store presented. So it's a different scenarios.
Okay.
Okay, so this is for this issue. I think because we broke previous experience for login and logout, so we needed to fix this for V1. What we just discussed is for the next three issues related to the error messages to try to get alignment whether we need to fix it by V1. Samuel, I saw your hand still up.
Yeah, I re-raised my hand because 696 was brought up again. So while we are at it, my quick question was, so the feature enhancement we have done in RC7 is that now Docker notation can read plain text credentials if available in the Docker config file, but only read it. It will never write. That's what I wanted to clarify.
No, notation never writes plain text credentials into any config file. No, notation will only write when there is a credential store present.
Okay, I think
So
that
only read. Yeah.
okay, that answered all my queries. Okay, then I'm good with this. Thanks.
Hi, Todi.
Just a question, what will be the behavior if there is no credential store on the machine?
So if there's no credential in the machine, and the user can still use Docker login if user install Docker CLI, and according to the Docker documentation, the default behavior is that none of credential store present. Docker will store the credential in a plain text format in Docker config.
Well, my actually ask is if you don't have Docker even.
If we don't have Docker, we cannot read these credentials, but there is a way for user to authenticate. That was documented in the notation authentication documentation that the user can use the environment variable to
So we will
authenticate with registry.
continue to use the environment variable for authentication. That's
Yeah.
what I
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So basically, login and logout will fail. Users can still use sign and verify command using either environment variables or parameters, command line parameters.
Yeah. In that case, yeah, login logout doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
So
Sorry.
that is a little bit convoluted as experience, but okay, we can discuss that. I don't think it's urgent to fix, but it's a little bit confusing as experience.
Hey,
ahead,
I
Sam.
raised. Yeah, so I think when you answered if Docker is not present, but when you say Docker not present, you don't mean the Docker application being present. Even if somebody has created a directory with .docker and even then the credential store can work, right? So Docker itself doesn't have to be installed. That path has to be present. I'm asking. I don't know. I'm asking that.
Yes, that's somewhat correct. We need Docker. Inside Docker folder, we need a file name config.json. If you have a credential there, then it works with notation. I don't encourage that solution because storing the credential in plain text is not good. So it's that it works somehow with because Docker supports it right now. So yeah, but I would refrain from documenting that with just notation. How can you do it?
So I think we should be a little bit more transparent on how we do that around the security. And where do we store these credentials in different situations will be actually good.
Oh yeah,
we
should document how we are reading it, but shouldn't say a way to avoid this is just store the credentials in at this path. Yeah, I agree with you. We should document how we are reading it, but we shouldn't document the workaround of not having a credential storage. Google and write your credentials here. We shouldn't document that.
Yeah, we should certainly, yes, not tell people how to do insecure stuff, right? But for example, I'm pretty sure we'll get very often questions like, I don't have Docker installed. I don't have Docker credential helper installed, right, on this machine, because the only thing I kind of want to do is I want to sign a SBOM. I don't even care about images. And in this situation, we need to tell like customers how to authenticate with the registry that has the SBOM.
Yeah, the way I would say is use the parameters, don't even log in. Then if it's a one-time thing you're going to do it, you don't actually need to log in, just sign with like notation sign -p and -u parameters, use that.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think we have that in the quick start, right? Just use the environment variables.
Yeah,
But-
we have that.
Yeah, so to me, passing the password into the to the command line argument is not safe, because the shell will record all those commands, and your password will be logged. That's why we use the environment variables. But according to the security audit, if you use the environment variables, it may expose to the plugins. Expose your password to your plugin that's not also insecure. So that means if you want totally secure stuffs, you may want to configure your credential stores for the credentials, and you may do notation login and then do notation sign.
Yes,
So
that should be the preferred way to do it, right? But we may need to document, for example, how can you configure the helper without, for example, doing a full installation of Docker?
No, you don't need to install the Docker for the Docker credential helpers. For example, you can just store the AWS ECR credential helper, or you can install Azure ACR credential helper only, and use those credential helpers in notation without Docker.
Yeah, that was my point. That you can do the credential helpers without Docker.
Yes, of course you can.
Yeah, so we should kind of do that as kind of recommended way, then using command line parameters or environment variables. That is what I'm saying.
Does all the registries have the helpers? I mean, I'm not sure about that.
Sorry, Feynman and Miran has their hands up, and we're talking over them.
I have an additional comment regarding the credential part. Actually, we are missing another configuration method, that is the general configuration file in notation. Can you open that link? I have shared a link about the directory structure, and there's a notation config file, which is similar to Docker config JSON file. Actually, I think, notation is using Aura's Credential Go to authenticate with the registry. So in general, notation will first read the configuration and check whether there is any registry authentication and credential information stored in the notation general configuration file. If not, it will second to check the Docker config JSON. If there's not, I think it will check the Docker credential store eventually. So I think the first step is to check if there is any credential information stored in the notation general configuration file. I think we're missing this part, and it should also be documented in notation website. And this is for users doesn't have Docker installed or configured. It will not rely on Docker config JSON. It's pure notation configuration file. Correct me if I'm not correct, Shui and Yi.
I think from the documentation point of view, Yes, at least in this document, it doesn't mention the notation config part. It's just mentioned if the credential store is the preferred way, the recommended way as a security best practice. So if it's not present, how to configure it, and if you didn't configure credential store, you can use the environment variable. But we didn't mention the configure for the notation configure file. So for that case, that means so user may think that the credential store are only related to the Docker, right? So in an environment, as Toddy explained, there's no Docker, but the user still can configure other credential store so that once it is configured in the notation configure file, or it is the default OS credential store, user can still log in successfully. I mean, using notation login successfully and store the credentials securely. Yeah, I see this. This could one thing we need to do is to improve the document and adding another scenarios as we discussed. Maren, please.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I lowered my hand. While I agree with all of you folks in terms of what the behavior should be if there's no credential store in place and everything, I initially, when noticing the issue, what the user has mentioned was that he has installed Docker Desktop on Windows and he tried to run it on WSL. To my understanding, at least from what I know and what I've used, WSL runs on an Ubuntu environment, right? So in that case, shouldn't he configure the credentials store as per mentioned in the notation documentation? If he wants to do a login, if that's the case, because I saw you on that page before. That's the same process I ran because when running WSL, since it's on an Ubuntu environment, I configure the credential store before logging in. I mean, that's what I assumed would be the expectation. That's why I just wanted to clarify. Of course, the credential store not being there and trying to log in, that should be fixed, but yeah. If someone could clarify that, because
so the credentials, so if you're using WSL, the credential store is going to need to be configured inside that Ubuntu environment because it has no visibility into the Windows environment other than shared volumes. Yeah,
exactly.
I think you've got it correctly.
So that's why I wanted to clarify if that isn't that like essentially the fix for this issue, if that's the case. Apart from credentials, no credentials store and fixing that.
I'd have to read the issue more to answer that. But yeah, he's using WSL just from the error messages here. If he's using WSL and WSL doesn't have Docker, then it wouldn't be able to install.
Yeah, exactly. Because what you would install in Windows wouldn't exactly translate to WSL, right? You have to.
It does have some shared stuff that goes on. So for instance, like I have WSL and I have Docker installed on my Windows machine, and it does share Docker with WSL. So I'm able to issue Docker commands from my WSL. On my Ubuntu distribution. So I'd have to look more into specifics to answer that. But you're right as far as configuring the notation environment. The notation environment is going to be a Windows specific one that has Windows path and Windows plugin paths. And then there's going to be the Ubuntu one that's in WSL. So he's going to have two different environments to configure if he's going to use notation back and forth between his Windows maybe PowerShell session and his WSL session.
Just wanted to point that out because I'm using it in a similar configuration. That's why. Anyways, carry on, I guess.
Anyone's got his hand raised.
Feeman, you have your hands up.
Oh, I just lowered. Sorry for missing that.
Yeah.
Okay, please.
So from all this conversation, I'm still not clear what is our guidance to the customers, right? That they should always use the credential stores, or and I'm also not sure. So what happens with the notation config JSON? Do we? Oh, I see that Shiwei replied. Notation code explicitly disabled that scenario. So does that mean that I cannot do anything with the notation config JSON that is related to authentication? Is that correct, Shiwei?
No, that's not right. So basically, the notation config can do everything just like the Docker config. However, you just cannot put plain text, plain text credential onto the config file using notation login. But by hacking, you can edit that file and put a credential into it by yourself, and let the notation read it as a workaround somehow, but it's not suggested.
Okay. So do we, let me kind of maybe, I hear a lot of workarounds and each one of them more insecure than the other one. I think that our overall goal is to actually make guidance to our customers that are for more secure configurations, not less secure. The things that I kind of don't find very secure are the environment variables, because I can go and read those, the command line parameters, which I can recall by actually getting the history, the Docker configuration, which stores actually in Docker config file as a plain text, the credentials, and the hack that actually you just described, Shiwei. So all these four options seem insecure for me, although they are possible for each customer. It seems that our guidance should be more driving towards using the credential helpers. And for customers that don't want to install Docker, our guidance should be to actually use the credential helpers without Docker installation, which means that we need to at least have some guidance how they can go and configure, let's say, AWS credential helper, or the OSX credential helper, or something like this. Or at the minimum, point them to the right guidance from Docker. Does that sound reasonable, or?
Actually, so the main point of all the efforts that is not using the credential helper is just for the OB, that's the out-of-box experience. So for the user who are using the notation first time, they just download the binary and try to use it, and without the credential helper, or they have already Docker installed. In that case, if we only support credential helper, if we only support credential store, then they will be frustrated to use notation. If they are using Linux, because on Linux there's no default Docker credential helper installed.
I am not saying to only support Docker credential helper. I am saying to document what is the preferred way to do it securely. We can continue to support all these four options, and if people want to hack them, that's up to them.
Okay, I think documentation is better. Yeah.
It kind of makes sense to use the same approach that they did with docs with managed identities. So managed identities for authentication to Azure is the preferred method, but it's the most complex setup, and degrades user experience, at least the onboarding experience. But it's still recommended, and it has recommended tags in the documentation. And then you have your environment variables that you can set. That's easier for development environment suggested setup, and that's the path. So maybe just documenting the different various authentication mechanisms and then tagging them recommended versus dev environment, or making a warning box of the unsecure state, like using the command line arguments versus environment variables would probably be a good way to just document kind of the guidance around the different auth methods.
Is there a draft PR for this that we can at least see what the change looks like?
Sorry, Sajid.
I mean, the question is, this change is risky or not, right? Like, is there a related PR that shows how risky this change is so that we can decide?
I think that is on the OR's credential go side, right, Shui?
Pardon?
The PR to fix this issue.
Yes. So we are fixing that at the ORA's credential goal side. Yeah, and in notation, we just need to upgrade the version.
Is the issue 71 on ORA's credential go? That links back to this issue?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So as a summary, sorry, Sajid, you want to say something?
No, I still can't figure out what's the PR. There's an issue over there, but what is the change that's actually happening? Is this the, no?
No, Sylvia is still working on it.
Okay, so the change is not yet.
Okay.
Like, there's no draft also for this. Okay.
Yeah, I also question on the issue there. Right now, we are saying we'll only support it for put operation there in the ORA's credential go. Like, I'm not sure whether this behavior should also translate to delete operation. Probably need some more thought on that. Someone is.
Can you repeat your question?
Okay, so the issue talks about only put operation on credentials. Basically, if you're trying to store credentials in credentials, then only the fallback will happen. What about delete operation? When someone's log out, should we also do a fallback there?
Yes, yes. So it's the same.
I have a comment there. Probably want to document the behavior.
Yeah, I think Sylvia will also document the behavior in the ORA's credential go. But if notation need a extra one, then notation should also do the documentation.
Okay, cool. I mean, if it's there, we can just link back the documentation there, or copy paste, link back the documentation to ORA's credential go if it's there.
Yeah, but I guess it will be in the Go doc, so might not be user friendly. I mean, to the end user, because Go doc is for developers.
Fine. Okay.
So Shui, one more question. Is this scoped outside WSL or is it only for WSL?
Well, what do you mean by WSL and
so is the crit store usage issue, like if I install it on Linux,
yeah,
just pure Linux or pure Mac or pure Windows, will that be a problem?
Yes, it will be a problem, but it's lucky that the on Windows and on Mac, the default credential store detected by ORAS is works similar to the default one that's in the Docker configure file. So it looks like the same, but it's different. So it's still a bug in the general way.
I think I got what Shiva you said, like there is a bug, but for Mac and Windows, that bug is not visible because notation falls back to the default OS store, which is the same.
Yes, exactly.
So that's why maybe Sajay is not seeing it on his Mac or Windows, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this is a common issue. Just the Windows and Mac OS has the default one, so notation fallback to that one. And the WSL is actually Linux, so so it hasn't default built-in credential manager. So notation failed to read the Docker config. That's the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering whether we could punt it for a 1.01 patch, but it seems like the bug is there. It's funny that the fallback behavior is exactly the same as the original behavior. So is it actually a bug is the question.
I think the issue here is the fallback is different between the operations. For sign, verify, this operation, the fallback behavior is different. For log in and log out, the fallback behavior is different.
I see. Okay.
So for example, let's say you don't have you are using pass on Mac OS, a third-party credential provider, helper, and you have configured it in Docker. Then Docker login will save the credentials in pass. Notation login will save the credential in OS keychain.
Okay.
So notation login won't even read that, okay, I have a Docker config file and I should use pass for that.
So you're leaning towards getting this fixed properly, right? Otherwise you end up with credentials in different places.
Yes, and it's more of a nuance.
Okay.
It's like not an functionality, but it's more of a nuance which will confuse user.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, this issue is found by all those negative test cases.
Sheesh, I should have not asked you to write the negative test cases. No, just kidding.
I think we spent a lot of time discussing this issue. So as a summary, I think we need to fix it in V1 since it's broke previous release experience. And we also need to improve the documentation. I mean, the end user documentation, like I showed here, to make it more clear that the user can have different options. And the credential store is the recommended way for our users, but the user do have other options. Do you agree with this? I take
Yes.
that as, yeah. Okay. Then let's do it quickly. So for these three issues, we think it won't break any existing behavior. So this will not be in the V1 release, right?
No, I think we said they can be in the V1 release. We just want to confirm that no test cases will fail and it's a low risk fix that can be in V1. That's what we said. So let's get the PR raised. Let's get the fix in. Once we have reviewed the PR at that point, after the PR review looks like it is low risk on all sides, then we can just include it in V1.
Okay, great. So for all these three issues, let's raise the PRs. So that based on the PR review, we can understand the risk, whether it could introduce other issues. Yeah, that's good point. So let's create the PR for these three issues.
Actually, for all four, we need a PR for all four pull requests. We look at the code changes for all four. We cross our T's and C's, and then we decide to check them in V1.
You mean this one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, all for PRs. Then we skip walk through the board, including some documentations. So please, Pradesh, Samuel, to review those documentation and spec, especially for the thread modeling, signature, specification. And I remember, Pritesh, you also have one for the revocation part, right? So please review those PRs for the documentation. And then next is to publish security advisories. So I think, Pritesh, you asked the questions about the severity, right? So is it okay that now we can publish these advisories? Do you agree with the answers from Adam?
I haven't read the answers. I will do reply it after the meeting. I will go through the answers quickly after the meeting and then reply on it.
Okay, thanks. So I think this already took some time. So it's better that we can finalize it as soon as possible. And this is also critical for V1 release. The next is the V1 block outline. I think this was prepared by Feynman. So please, Samuel or Pritesh can also take a look, and we need to jointly working on this block for V1. Then next is the vote for the for new repository. I saw some answers now. This repository is for setup notation GitHub actions. And I do agree with Josh that we also need to have an additional one for notation sign actions. And maybe for verify, we also need another action.
I did come, so I was drafting a reply. So this might throw a wrench in that a little bit, but I was looking at Trivi's action, and if we follow that pattern, we might be able to get away with a single action just called notation sign or notation action, I mean. And how they do that is so I have right now an action that sets it up, and then the sign would be a separate step or a separate action. What they actually do is they use a Docker file to automate the install on the runner. So on the runner, it starts the container, and then it runs the commands through an entry point, and then it uses a bash script to parse all the parameters. And so after Samir's questions, each action is going to repeat the same parameter sets. And so it might make sense to follow what Trivi's done here, because they have a very similar setup where they have a command line tool that has a lot of different options to it. So that might be something that we want to consider, is to follow their pattern there, because if we go the other route where we have a repository for setup and then a repository for sign and then verify, each of those are going to need the same data being passed into it, like the key name and the plugin name and all that stuff. It's just going to be very repetitive. Plus, then you'll have 3 repositories to version as the CLI increases. So that was a good pattern that I thought I just wanted to throw out there. It means refactoring everything that I've done, but I'm totally fine with that and willing to do that work, or at least work on it.
So with that, I think we need to continue. Where is the issue? Continue the discussion on the vote issue. This one, to align that whether we use the Trivi pattern only one action, or we use separate actions. As Josh pointed out, there could be some parameters, right? Need to be need to have for all 3 repositories.
Will there be any difference in UX for users, how they configure it?
It'll be the same parameters. So instead of having 2 separate actions, it'll just pass that same data to the install step. So it'll add the plugin, and then it'll take that same parameter and apply it to the sign command. If you look at the bash script that they have in there in the entry point, it's pretty intricate, the bash script that they have, where it goes through and kind of assembles all the parameters. But it seems to be, in my opinion, probably the easier path to moving forward as far as maintenance is concerned, and keeping everything in sync.
I think because once we decide on this one, we will create the repository, right? So if later we think, for example, we think we don't use setup notation, we want to do something like a Trivi actions. so that we need to vote again to change the name or something else. So maybe to make everyone on the same page, maybe Josh, you can help to prepare a POC or a demo to show how we are going to do for notation actions, so that everyone can understand clearly. What do you think?
Yeah, I can take the work that I've done and translate it into that new pattern and present that, if that works.
Yeah, I think so one way is use the trivia action, right? We include everything there. Another is we have 3 repositories. Yeah, so any comments from other people? My comments is that for the notation verification, it could be separate because user don't need to sign, right? In cases, they don't need to sign, but they do need to maybe in some cases they use the notation CLI, so that means they need to install CLI, so that they need to use the setup notation, and then they use the notation verify. But in some cases, they may be, for example, use ratify, which consume notation Go libraries. So in that case, there's no notation setup, no notation sign, just a notation, kind of a notation verify. So
what parameters would you need for verify? Would you need to know key or anything like that? Like the key name or?
For verify, I think only the C certificates as is for now.
The cert name.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, and also the policies. So maybe it's maybe Josh, you can help to prepare a demo so that we can understand it better for the scenarios. Yeah. Samuel, please.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be nice to have a single action that we can collate on, but if that single action starts becoming very complicated, then it's okay to split it. Like, I will prefer a single action. That's my initial thought. And you can pass all the arguments to it. If some argument is not used, it is not used. You can pass that argument as empty. But I will prefer what Josh was thinking about from that link he shared. I was reading through it. I think a single action will keep things simple for everybody. They don't have to think about which one to use. Just use a single action, set up your parameters, and you're done. But let's have the demo done, and then we can probably iterate on it more.
Shui, Feeman, Toddy,
Yeah,
anyone else?
Yeah, there's another advantage if we first focus on the single actions. As you know, GitHub Marketplace, they will not have the strict review process if we publish notation GitHub actions as a single actions for just notation setup. But if we have multiple actions in a notation GitHub actions, they will need to review, and they will have the review process before we publish into GitHub Marketplace. I think this is a little bit different for we using single or multi actions when we publish it to GitHub Marketplace. And I would prefer that we can create a setup actions for notation V1 as a first step. Then we can investigate and demo for notation sign, as it requires us to securely handle the notation key generation and management. It might be a little bit complicated. That's my 2 cents.
So just to reiterate, it'd be to keep them like move forward with just sign. So you're setting up the environment, and then kind of for V1, signing and verify would be like running a bash part of your workflow, and just the action would handle the installation and setup of like the plugin. Is that the proposal?
My proposal is that we can split those different steps into different actions. For example,
Okay.
we can have the notation set up as the first step and publish it to GitHub Marketplace for notation V1. We are very close to the notation V1. So in that case, users will be able to call notation GitHub actions set up in their GitHub CI/CD pipeline. So maybe we can first prepare the notation setup just for information. I think Mira has his opinion.
Sorry, my mistake.
No worries. So I think, yeah, maybe it's just better I can go and demo both and bring them both, because the way that I've seen the actions play out, there's the trivia pattern where they have a single action that does everything. And then oftentimes there's just a setup action where they're installing the CLI on the runner with all the configurations. And then any kind of action that you want to take beyond setup is handled by a bash script. So there are some, the example on that, the latter case would be the setup notation action is out there. It'll install the binary, it will set up the plugin for you. But then as far as signing and verifying using the CLI, that's done by just using a bash script or a bash run with inside the workflow. And so those are kind of the two, at least the starting gate for both. But I can kind of put together, a POC for both of those and present them, because yeah, I'm open to either. I don't have the best answer. I've got a lot more work done, obviously, in the setup notation one than the combined one. And I don't have a clear answer either way, which one would be the best one moving forward. But those are kind of the two patterns that I've seen as far as GitHub actions are concerned.
Shui, please.
Yes. So Josh, when you do the prototyping, can you just write it in JavaScript instead of a Docker container? Because I don't think Docker container can be used cross-platform, but we need the notation in on Mac host, Windows host, and also the Linux host. So I think the JavaScript may be the better one.
Okay. So we plan to have this action used on Windows GitHub runners?
Yes, it's supposed to be run on Windows, Mac, and Linux GitHub runners.
Yeah, they probably have to. Yeah, I'm not sure if GitHub will support multiple. I know you could do different images, but I don't know if the action would support you kind of choosing your image at runtime, so to speak. So I'll look into it. I'll see how I could repeat the pattern with JavaScript.
As far as I know, Docker containers can be only used in GitHub Actions for Linux. It cannot be applied to Windows or Mac.
Do they have Mac runners?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
And 10 times the cost of the Linux.
Good to
know. Yeah, Maron.
Yeah, so I was going to agree with Josh. Having two kind of demos would be better, like the one with a all-in-one kind of inclusive use of notation action, and just a setup one, because mostly in my testing, at least, and for my purpose, I've been using his setup action with a bash script as well, using the notation CLI. So I think there's quite a use case for that. So it would be good to see both and maybe have both as well. Just my opinion on that.
Okay, thanks. We only have 1 minute left, so I think the next step for this is maybe Josh can help to prepare a POC so that we can have a better understanding on it. Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thanks. Okay,
and
then
yeah, I just want to request if you can get the RC7 release notes posted today. I think we have completed our review.
Yeah, I will take a look after this meeting for the comments and resolve it. And yeah.
There's a good question about let's see, how do we phrase it? So what would be is there a use case for cross-platform runners, or would it be acceptable to have like a Ubuntu runner for the GitHub action? Because the CLI will support the many different platforms. Do we expect to have a lot of traffic on a Windows runner or a Mac runner that would be signing with Notation CLI? Or is that just kind of a commitment that the project's made to have the cross-platform and make sure that the actions can run on all the runners? Because I know that there's a lot of incentive, and if you look, there's a lot more usage from Ubuntu runners or Linux runners for GitHub Actions is concerned versus Windows or Mac.
So this question is to Shui or?
Yeah, in just general. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to gauge like how critical is it that we do cross-platform runners, given that it might be a very niche kind of use case or edge case, I guess, for the runner, because a lot of the runners are Ubuntu, a lot of the free tiers, and it's cheaper to run Ubuntu versus having the different actions. Or is it that we want to support? Is there a notion or a kind of like a commitment, I guess, that we want to support every cross-platform and the runners, like the CLI does, right? There's a binary for OS or for Mac OS, and there's a binary for Windows and a binary for Linux. I was just curious if there's any added context.
Yeah, I think we can continue the discussion in the Slack channel. If Josh, you want to continue to discuss it, we are over time. I think this one, who added this one? So if it is not urgent for V1 release, maybe we can discuss next time for the lessons header. Okay.
Yeah, I think we can move it to the next meeting. But
Okay.
This is a follow-up for Zach's request. Zach asked us to check if there's any license violations or compliance issues in notation. So I requested an issue to request checking the license header for notation and its dependencies. We can add this process in notation GitHub CI process.
Okay. Yeah, we can discuss it next week, right? Okay. Thanks, Freeman. Okay. Then as a summary, so we will create PRs for what we discussed for these 4 issues, and we will review PRs to decide whether it can impact a lot of other scenarios. If not, we will merge it for V1 release. And we will speed up the PR reviews for the documentation, and we will cut this, we will merge this RC7 block as soon as possible. Otherwise, the V1 block is going to out. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice day.
You too. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Okay.
Right.
Bye.